Okay, so I suppose we can start in prayer in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, God, for giving us the opportunity to unite here, and thank you for allowing it. And as everything that you allow, you turn it into something good. So I ask that today you can forgive us of any trespass that is stopping us from receiving your blessings, and also guide my lips today so that I may be guided and I may be used as a tool, that you can use for your glory, and so that everybody can understand that you're the Almighty God who loves them. And show us today with these evidences by your grace that the holy books that you've written for us are historically accurate and that we could trust them. And rid my mouth of all error, and humble my heart, humble my soul, humble me, so that I do not say anything off of pride or arrogance, but instead for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So we're going to start off first with the book of Exodus itself. So it was written, it's historically believed that it was written by Moses, okay, just like the book of Genesis. And in fact, I have a little verse right here that you could write down if you all would like to write down a verse. Starting off, Exodus 34:27. Exodus chapter 34, verse 27, okay? In that verse, God tells Moses to write down, okay? And so that's explicit evidence from the Bible itself that Moses did write, okay? And in fact, even in the New Testament, Jesus says, Moses wrote about me. So Moses did definitely write. Now, did he write all of the Pentateuch? There's that debate that some people say, well, he wrote most of it. He didn't write all of it. Like in the very end of the Deuteronomy, it talks about how he died, was buried, and there hasn't rose a prophet like him to this day. I don't think Moses would write that. Somebody else wrote it after him. But for the most part, Moses definitely did write the Pentateuch based on what's written here in Exodus 34:27, as well as what Jesus said when he said, Moses wrote about me. And he was actually speaking to the Pharisees. And this is proof that it wasn't just written down. It's not like Moses wrote something down and then it was lost. It's that Jesus in that context was talking to the Pharisees saying, well, if you truly believed what's written, and if you truly were of Moses and a follower of Moses, you would believe what he wrote about me. So that means that it's something that was written that the Pharisees had, access to. The law, basically, the law of Moses, the Pentateuch. And so Moses definitely did write at least the majority of it, right? And he was an eyewitness of the things that occurred. So the book of Exodus, the term Exodus means exit. So that's easy for us English speakers, right? In Hebrew, it's a different name. That's basically what we get from the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. So the Greek version, it's Exodus or exit. But in the Hebrew, it literally is just the first words of the book of Exodus, because in Hebrew, in the Hebrew tradition, the way that they name the books of Moses is basically by the first words of the book. So for example, Genesis would be in the beginning. That's the name of the book in Hebrew. And then Genesis would be the Greek version of that. And so Exodus is the Greek version. Exodus, the name Exodus comes from the Greek Septuagint, and it means exit. And the audience, as far as the audience is concerned, it is actually the ancient Hebrews. And so when we read the book of Exodus, we do got to keep that in mind. That way we understand it in the ancient context, not in our 21st century mindset. And let's see, another thing that's important to mention is that, it was written more or less around 1250 BC to 1200 BC. So that's a date that you could write down, 1250 BC to 1200 BC, somewhere around there, approximately after the time of the Exodus. So I'm kind of spoiled a little bit, which date I subscribe to, but I'm going to show you the evidences of each one, because there's two primary dates that people will bring up when you ask them, when did the Exodus happen? Now, of course, if you're asking somebody who doesn't believe in the Exodus, they're going to say, well, it never happened. But if you're asking actual people who believe in the Exodus, and I'm going to show you the evidences for an actual, that basically show that the book of Exodus is historically accurate. The two primary dates that they give is 1446 BC or 1265 BC. And so if you're listening to this video, you can just keep going back to write them down, okay? 1446 BC and 1265 BC. Those are the two primary dates. The 1446 BC date is called the early date because it happened earlier. And then the other one is called the late date. So if the proponents of a late date, they're called late date proponents, right? 1265 BC is what it's referring to. Early date would be 1446 BC. Okay. Now, the people that say, well, it happened in 1446 BC, the people that say that, the reason why they say that is, number one, because they go to 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. 1 Kings in the Bible, right? 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. There it says that when the time that the Temple of Solomon was built, which is probably around the year more or less 960 BC, in that same book, it says that 480 years prior was when the Israelites essentially exited Egypt and they, headed over to the promised land. So if you add those dates up, you get about 1446 BC. And so that's what they say. They say, well, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, you're going to see that this is probably the best case that they have. Because if you take the time that 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 is referring to, which is 960, add 480 to that, you do get this date, 1446 BC, or around it, right? And so how do we respond to that if we subscribe to the 1265 BC date? Well, here's the thing. 1 Kings chapter 6, it's talking about a temple. It's a temple inscription. It's talking about when the Temple of Solomon was built. Okay. And then it adds 480 years from the time of the Exodus. And so if you take it in a literal sense, you are going to get 1446. But the problem with that is that temple inscriptions throughout the ancient Middle East, remember what I just said? We have to read it with an ancient mindset, not with our 21st century American mindsets. If we do that, we're going to see that in the ancient Middle East and in the ancient Near East, temple inscriptions never gave precise dates. They never gave an exact amount. Instead, the numbers were meant to reflect a numerical pattern or a base system. An example, and I probably should have wrote this down, but I'll just give this example. Tukulti Ninurta I, he was a Mesopotamian king. And he basically made a temple to a god called Ishtar. And so it's a temple inscription of the ancient Middle East, just like this was, 1 Kings chapter 6. The way that he describes the last time that it was built, because his time more or less is like the year, I believe it's the 13th century. The last time the initial construction of that temple was about 20th century. So it is about 700 years. But instead of saying about 700 years, he gave the year 720 years. Exactly. But if you look at it historically, it's not a precise date. It's not exactly accurate. Instead, it's based on the number 60. And how do we know that? Because the Mesopotamians believed that the number 60, that was something sacred about it. Their base system was actually base 60 system, unlike ours, which is base 10. So their whole civilization revolved around this number 60. And so whenever they wanted to describe a long period of time, an undefined long period of time, they would just use the number 60 or a multiple of 60. 720 is 60 times 12. And so he used that term 720 years, even though it's not an exact amount. It's just trying to use a multiple of 60, which they consider to be sacred and central to their civilization. And it described a long period of time. Guess what? This is exactly what the number 40 is for the Israelite culture. The number 40 was meant to describe just a long period of time, an imprecise long period of time. Sometimes it was literal. Sometimes it was literally 40 years or 40 days. Other times it was not. How do we know that it's not literal? Because it's describing a temple inscription. And temples inscriptions in the ancient Middle East, all of them in the ancient Middle East and in the ancient Near East was not precise dating. Instead, it was meant to revolve around specific numbers that they used for, sacred purposes. It is a temple inscription, so they often use the number 7, right? Like 7 days it took for a priest to become a priest. But the term 40 was just meant a long period of time, unprecise long period of time. Okay. This is actually the best case that they have for the early date, 1446 BC, that the Exodus occurred. This is the best evidence that they have, the 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. But if you understand it in an ancient Middle Eastern mindset and an ancient Hebrew mindset, you're going to realize that, well, they're just trying to describe a long period of time. Okay. Does that make sense? And in fact, the number 40 is not just for the ancient Israel, also the ancient Moabites. And I believe also the Ammonites also use the term 40 to describe a long period of time. It wasn't exact. Okay. Also, there was a king, I believed, in Egypt. He ruled for like 12 years. Guess what they said about him? That he ruled for 40. Even though he didn't rule for 40, he ruled for only 12. It was just a long period of time is what they were trying to say. And so you got to understand in the ancient mindset, okay? Another thing that they point to is the Book of Judges, but it's very dumb for somebody like there. You have no idea what they're talking about if they use the Book of Judges. And it's okay because there was a time where I had no idea what I was talking about, and I'll describe why right now. Sometimes they use the Book of Judges. They say, look, the Bible says Jephthah says from his time period, which is about 1100 BC, it was about 300 years since they established in Egypt, which was, if you use that number, you get to about 1400 BC. And so they would say, aha, 1446 BC is when the Exodus occurred. They were 40 years in the desert. 1400 BC is when they entered. Exactly like Jephthah says. So the Exodus happened in 1446 BC. There's a problem with this, though. It's that the author of the Book of Judges is trying to show you that Jephthah has no idea what he's talking about because he's talking to the Ammonites, They were descendants of Lot. So were the Moabites. They were also descendants of Lot, but they had two different civilizations. Jephthah had no idea what he was talking about, that he mixed them up. He thought the Moabites were Ammonites, basically, because he told basically the Ammonites that their god, known as Chemosh or Chemosh, that's not their god. That's the god of the Moabites, not the Ammonites. And he got them confused. And then he began to say things like, well, you don't have a right to this land anyways, even though I think they got displaced by the Amorites. So they were there to begin with. So why is he saying that they don't have a right to the land? Right? Also, that's another thing. And so the idea, the context is that he has no idea what he's talking about, especially with that confusing their gods, saying that, oh, your god is Chemosh, even though that's not the name of their god. That was the name of the Moabite deity, not the Ammonite. Also, Jephthah was the same guy that told God, Lord, if you let me win, I will sacrifice the first person that walks into my house, which was his daughter. You really think a smart person is going to say, I'm going to sacrifice the first person that comes into my door? Who's going to come into your door? Your mom, your dad, your daughter, your son. The whole point of Jephthah, or not the whole point of Jephthah, but the whole point of the Book of Judges describing Jephthah, trying to describe him as a guy that wasn't very smart. And so why are you using him, to date the Exodus? In terms of the Bible, that's pretty much all they're going to point to. But another thing that I'd like to mention is that there's a stela. Now, stelas were actually Egyptian monuments, or Egyptian documents, I guess you could say, like as a general term. There's one called the 400-year stela, the 400-year stela, or year 400 stela. This is what it says. Ramses I and Seti I, those were pharaohs in Egypt. They said that there's a temple that was built by King Merneptah, who was a Hyksos king, a foreign ruler. And they described it as being on the 400, that's why it's called the 400-year stela, on the 400th year. Look at how precise it is. 400th year, 4th month, 4th day. Except that it didn't happen because the Hyksos at that point had only been there like 350 years prior, not 400 years prior. And so again, it's not exactly accurate. It's not meant to be. It's meant to use numbers to reflect something symbolic. Okay, so numbers were used in a very symbolic fashion in ancient times in those regions. Okay, and so that's what it has. That's how it is with numbers. So another thing that people might point to, I'm not going to go into huge depth, but it's just if you hear it, that way you know what they're talking about. There's something called the Amarna letters, and they say something like, oh, the Amarna letters written by the Egyptians, and they talk about the Habaru, right? The Habaru, that's the Hebrews, and the Hebrews, it talks about how they went and conquered areas, and it mentions Jerusalem. And this was back like in, we're talking, 15th century BC, so the early date is the correct date of the Exodus, 1446 BC. This was, back in those times. There's a lot of problems with that. Number one, it's actually more complex than that because the dating extends well into, centuries after. So there's no way that you could say, oh, it's this date that you're talking about, right? When they say, oh, it's this date, we're actually not so certain because it actually extends into different eras. And so the dating is not very, we don't know exactly when we could date a lot of the information there. But even with that, it still doesn't make sense to use the Amarna letters, because first of all, the term Habaru can refer to the Hebrews, but not necessarily. Habaru literally just means dirty, low class, hobos. It's kind of like using the term hobo. It's like you're kind of low class, and it's supposed to be sort of derogatory, right? Now, of course, we wouldn't refer to a homeless person as dirty or that kind of stuff. That's not Christian like. But in ancient Egypt, for example, they would use that term Habaru. You're just a peasant. You're yeah. Okay. And so it doesn't necessarily refer to the Hebrews. And we know that in the Amarna letters, it's not referring to the Hebrews. Why? Because in those Amarna letters, which they quote, I don't know why they quote it, but it talks about these Habaru going and attacking all the way north to Lebanon. The Israelites didn't go to Lebanon. The farthest that they went was to Dan. Lebanon is way farther north. The Hebrews didn't go that far, because it talks about how they went and they started attacking a guy named, they attacked Byblos in Lebanon. That's in Lebanon. That's not in the area that the Israelites went and in their conquest after the Exodus. So it's not even referring to the Hebrews, it's referring to another group of people.
The Hebrews are the Israelites.
Yeah, so yeah. Hebrew is basically. Now the term Hebrew was actually more general in ancient times. Like Abraham was called a Hebrew because he was a descendant of Eber, right? And so even though Abraham was not an Israelite, because an Israelite is a descendant of Jacob. But later on, it started to just refer to, just Israelite people. Okay. And so another document that they might mention is the Shashu of Yahweh, or the nomads, also known as the nomads of Yahweh inscription. They say, oh, the nomads of Yahweh. That's the name of God in the book of Exodus, Yahweh. And they were nomadic, right? The Israelites were traveling from one place to another. This is referring to the Israelites. And then they would use it to try to support an early date, 1446 BC of the Exodus. But this also fails for at least two reasons, okay? And so these people that bring up this evidence, they never really looked at it because it actually backfires completely. First of all, it doesn't say nomads or Shashu, the Shashu of Yahweh. It doesn't say that. It says the Shashu of Yahu. It doesn't say Yahweh. It says Yahu. And so even the name is not the name of God, or it'll be unlikely that's referring to the name of God because it's not referring to the Israelites. And this brings me to my second point. It's not referring to the Israelites, right? It's not referring to the Israelites because these group of people, basically, make a long story short, it's talking about a group of people that held some Edomites or some people captive in Edom, in the land of Edom. If y'all remember Edom, that's the land that was established by who? Esau, the descendants of Esau, right? Edom. There's a problem though, is that during the wandering period after the Exodus from Egypt, the Israelites, right after the Exodus from Egypt, they did not enter Edom. They were turned away. They asked the Edomite king if they could pass through, and he said no. So they went around, and I think they went around Moab as well. They went around them. They didn't enter. So why would they hold captives in Edom? It's not talking about the Israelites. And so all of these documents, there's pretty much nothing in support. Like I said, the best thing that they used to support an early date is 1 Kings chapter 6. But if you understand how ancient temple inscriptions were written, the dating was not meant to be a precise, exactly. It was meant to reflect a long period of time. So now this moves me into the actual date of the Exodus, which is 1265 BC. And so if you want to write that down, 1265 BC, and then highlight it or underline it. How do we know this? Well, in the same book of Exodus, first of all, Exodus chapter 1, and Exodus chapter 1, it talks about some cities that the Israelite slaves built. So for those of you that don't know the history, Egypt enslaved the Israelites. They were enslaved. and they forced them to build cities, to build cities basically for the king. And in Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, so if you'd like to write that down, Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, Exodus 1:11, in the Bible, it tells us that they built the cities of Pithom and P Ramses. I wrote that down up here, P Ramses. So they built, P Ramses stands for House of Ramses. So they built the House of Ramses. But wait a minute, the headquarters of Ramses in this city was not built historically until the time of Ramses II. So how could the Israelites have left Egypt back in 1446 BC if they built the city of Ramses, which didn't come about until the time of Ramses II? Because that's when the headquarters were moved to this place, and the city of Ramses, which is about 2 kilometers from where the Israelites lived.
All the numbers were off.
Historically, yeah. So if you actually want to look at the historical documents, you can't believe in 1446 BC as the time of the Exodus. You got to believe in 1265 BC, and I'll mention why it's 1265 BC. It happened during the time of King Ramses II. That's when they built the House of Ramses, or P Ramses. And the headquarters of Ramses II was here in the city of Ramses, about 2 kilometers away from the town of Avaris. Why is the city of Avaris important? This is where the Israelites lived, for the most part. Some of them were scattered throughout the Wadi Tumalat, but for the most part, they were in Avaris. And I'll describe why we believe that they were in Avaris. And so now, if you look at the maps, if you guys, those that took pictures on the phone, it wasn't what?
Cairo?
No. Cairo was farther south. Farther south. Okay? And in fact, I mean, I just looked at it right here on the map. Actually, Cairo is south, on the other side of Memphis, south of On. And so here I'm going to turn over for those of you that would like to look, see that. So this is the land of Goshen, right? This is the picture that I'm looking at. So you've got to put the picture on your phone. This is the land of Egypt. That's Goshen right there. Goshen is where they established in that region. It was very fertile, a lot of greenery, a lot of orchards, a lot of very fertile land. You could produce a lot of fruit. Okay. They established in that region. More specifically, we're going to focus in on the city of Avaris. So if you go to the next picture, okay. Avaris is right here, all the way to the eastern side of the Nile. You see that's Avaris? You see that Avaris? Avaris in Egypt, Avaris. Do you see the name Avaris? Avaris is right over here to the east. Avaris. Okay. And do you all see that in those of you that are using phones? Avaris is right to the eastern side. It's on the right side of the picture. The second picture that you all took. Avaris, Avaris. Avaris. And the city of P Ramses is about 2 kilometers from that. So it's not the same town. It's about 2 kilometers away, which is a pretty good distance. And I'll mention why in a second. And we found, a lot of the things that are found there, like, for example, the house architecture is very Semitic. It's not Egyptian style. It's very like Semitic. They found, the remains of goats and sheep, but Egyptians didn't eat that. They ate beef. They ate cattle. Okay. The Asiatic Semitic populations, however, they ate sheep. They ate goats. They ate lamb. Okay. So that's where the evidence shows that they were established. Okay. And there's a lot to go over. It's amazing. And we haven't even gone through the evidences. So you guys are going to be amazed at all the stuff. Okay. So the Pharaoh during the Exodus was, from the evidence that we have, is Ramses II. And his firstborn mysteriously died in the year 1265 BC. And so if an Exodus happened during Ramses II, it happened around that time, 1265 BC, after the death of the firstborn, which is one of the plagues, right? Pharaoh's firstborn died. And that actually happened historically. King Ramses II, firstborn, mysteriously died. The Egyptians recorded it. Okay. So that's one piece of evidence. Now, of course, we didn't have cameras back then, so it's not like we say, look, here's a video. As you can see, there's Moses there walking with a staff. We don't have that. But the evidence that we could find, I'm trying to show that it actually, correlates or corresponds to what's written. There's no contradiction. if the book of Exodus is true, then the evidence that we have is exactly what we'd expect. And so I'm going to show you all the evidence, and you're going to go, okay, well, you know, it correlates perfectly fine. You know, there's no contradictions. There's you know, we find exactly what we would expect, right? Okay. And so a lot of people complain, like, for example, the wandering period, there wasn't, you know, we don't find like artifacts of Israelites. But I mean, for a long time, there was a nomadic tribes traveling through all over, you know, that area, and they didn't leave any remains either. That doesn't mean that they were never there. Okay. So, but what about the evidence that we do actually have? Well, we do have, oh, by the way, here's another thing that kind of further shows that it happened under Ramses II, the Exodus. In Exodus chapter 12, remember how I talked about the distance between Avaris and the headquarters of Ramses II? It's about 2 kilometers away. In Exodus chapter 12, it talks about how Moses and Aaron would go and talk to Pharaoh. In Exodus chapter 12, they went in the middle of the night and they went to go talk to Pharaoh. They did their business and then they were back by morning. So that means that whenever the Exodus happened, whatever Pharaoh was there, the Pharaoh had to live close, right? If they lived far, they wouldn't have time to go walking or you know, yeah, go over there and then come back, right? They wouldn't have enough time to do that in the middle of the night and then come back by morning time. They'd have to be close. And so this couldn't have happened during the 18th dynasty, because remember, some people say, oh, it happened in 1446 BC, which is false. That period was the 18th dynasty in Egypt. The 18th dynasty in Egypt, okay? During that time, the Pharaoh lived in Thebes, which was very far away from Avaris, very far away from where the Israelites lived. They wouldn't have enough time to go there in the middle of the night and then come back by morning, especially with all the talking that they had to do with Pharaoh. Okay. And so that's another example that, you know, it couldn't have been at this time. Now, during the 18th dynasty, there was a palace in Avaris, which was where the Israelites lived. However, it was mostly used for administrative purposes. It wasn't actually used for living, because if the Pharaoh was going to live there, he's not going to live by himself. That palace was very small. It wasn't enough space to have his servants, his concubines, right? His royal family, his royal court, right? All of that had to house the Pharaoh. And so it was likely just used for administrative purposes. It wasn't actually used to live there. Okay. And so other early date proponents will say, oh, well, what about, you know, there was a time where the capital was moved to Memphis, right? The headquarters of the Pharaoh were moved to Memphis. That's still far away. That's like from here to Fairfield. You're not going to have time to go there in the middle of the night, talk to somebody, right? Handle your business and then come back by morning. They didn't have, you know, electromotive vehicles and all that back then. And so the most likely time period, again, especially considering the fact that they built the headquarters, right? I mean, they built the house of Ramses, the city of Ramses, right? They actually built it. They actually partook in the building of that, which didn't happen until the time of Ramses II. I mean, it all correlates perfectly to this period right here. Okay. What's next? We have the Merneptah Stela. Now, I just mentioned stelas. They're ancient Egyptian documents, right? The Merneptah Stela, right? Which dates to about the year 1203 BC or 1200 BC. Okay. Let me explain to you a little something about stelas. Stelas were created to glorify the king. It was to make the king look awesome, look great. You are not to write down any mistakes that the king made or that the kings made. It was to make the Egyptian king look like he was filled with glory, like he was awesome, right? So in this Merneptah Stela, this is what it says. And this is amazing. This is pretty cool evidence for Israel and Egypt. It says, Israel is laid waste and his seed is no more. Israel is laid waste and his seed is no more. This was written by Egyptians trying to glorify the king, trying to say, well, Israel was destroyed by the king of Egypt. What does this tell you? That at some point there was interaction between Israel and the Egyptians. Now the Egyptians here are claiming it as a victory. But in the Bible, it says that the God of Israel won. Who won, the God of Israel or the Egyptian army? Well, if we look at this thing alone, it's not going to prove it to us, because remember why stelas were written? To glorify the king, to give credit to the king, even if it's not due. That's why, if you look at the Kadesh inscription, there's something called the Kadesh inscription. It was a war between the Hittites, a battle in Kadesh Barnea between the Hittites and the Egyptians. The Hittites won historically. Guess who took it as a victory? The Egyptians. And they said that they destroyed the Hittites, even though they didn't. They were taking it as a victory to glorify the king. And so we can't look at this and go, oh, well, the Egyptians defeated Israel, because again, they did it to glorify the king, even giving him credit where it was not due. Now, what else is interesting about the stela, the Merneptah Stela, is that the hieroglyphic that was used to say Israel, they used a 3-stroke hieroglyphic to designate this as a person. Israel, a person, and descendants flow from him. It's a people group, Jacob. So this is evidence of an actual person outside the Bible named Jacob, from whom the Israelites came, or named Israel, from whom the Israelites came from. And so they gave him a 3-stroke hieroglyphic, which is meant to say, this is not an actual nation or yet, right? This is not actually a nation yet, but a people group that descended from a man named Israel. Okay. And so another thing that people say is, well, the Israelites couldn't have been slaves in Egypt because the Egyptians only enslaved prisoners of war, not domestic slaves. So for example, let's say we're living in Egypt in that time, they're not going to enslave us because we're living there, only if we were a prisoner of war. There's a problem with that though, because the ancient historical documents that we have show that the town of Avaris, which is where the Israelites lived, they were considered prisoners of war. And I'm going to read that to y'all here. So if y'all would like to write that down, just write down Ahmose, 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 son of Abana. So son of Ebona, Ebona. Ahmose, son of Abana. He was basically a militant that was told to conquer Avaris. And so Avaris was treated as something to be conquered in a warlike fashion. Not something that belongs to us, not something that's part of us, but like, because remember, the Hyksos ruled there, and the Hyksos were outsiders who came into Egypt. They conquered Lower Egypt or the northern side of Egypt. And they had their headquarters where? In Avaris. So the enemies were headquartered in Avaris. And so we're going to conquer them. We're going to conquer the people there. And then we're going to, the Israelites, yeah, were living there, but also Amorites live there. Also some Egyptians live there. I think Hittites also might have lived there too, right? And so they were treated as slaves. And we know this because in the biography of Ahmose, son of Abana, it's recorded that when he went and he conquered the area, he got some slaves for himself. He got slaves from there. And so they were treated as prisoners of war. Now, he is a general, which means that if he gets some slaves, the Pharaoh is going to receive a lot of slaves, because whatever he would receive, the booty or the spoils that he would get from war, the Pharaoh would get more. And so that means what? That the Pharaoh received a lot of slaves from there. And so they were considered prisoners of war. Who? Well, if you look throughout, history when the Jews were mistreated, it is not because of, well, I don't think it was because of this per se. I think that, well, it depends on it depends on the mentality of the people that were mistreating them. Like the Nazis would say that they were, not people to be regarded with human value, right? And so with different people throughout history, they were subjugated in different ways. It depends on what the context is. Well, nobody really ever said like, well, I don't think, right? People would say, well, you used to be a slave. I mean, maybe now they probably say like, you used to be, your ancestors were slaves, so you need to be a slave, right? it depends on, yeah, it really depends. So yeah, so mistreatment of anybody, right? You got to look at it, you know, in the situation. It does require dehumanizing them in order to enslave them and in order to treat them badly. Otherwise, there's going to be a riot, right? If you feel like, oh, this person's not human or this person does not deserve human rights, you're not going to say anything. But if you know that this person is made in God's image, then you're going to speak out against that, right? And so, and finally, another thing that atheists or people that don't believe in an actual Exodus will say is that, well, why were they going into Cana if Cana was a colony of the Egyptians? Why would they go into more Egypt? Well, it turns out that during this time period, during this time that the Exodus occurred in, you know, during the time of King Ramses II, Egypt began to lose power over its rule, over its colonies. And so by the time that they actually got into Cana, it was pretty much safe from Egyptian rule. Because even though it was strong, Egypt was very strong, but they began to weaken, which is why I'm struggling to remember in the moment, but I believe that it was some Nubian peoples went and attacked Egypt, and they defeated Egypt shortly after with like an army of like, I don't recall the fact actually. I'm not going to say it. If I remember next week, I could bring it up. But it's basically proof that the Egyptian army, or the Egyptians began to weaken shortly after. And so there was, by the time that the Israelites got to Canaan, it was safe from Egyptian rule. Right? Yeah, and so next thing that I'm going to go over is the tomb of Rekhmire at Thebes. It shows Semitic and Nubian prisoners of war making mud bricks, which is exactly what's described in the book of Exodus. We have Papyrus Anastasi 4, where we have quotas, right? So you got to make a certain amount, right? It would say that an administrator was complaining because he didn't have enough slaves and enough straw to produce the quantity of mud bricks that the king wanted, or that the quota asked for. And Papyrus Anastasi 3, which is another ancient Egyptian document, it says that it talks about a quota being established. So you got to make a certain amount of mud bricks, which is exactly what we find in Exodus, right? You got to make a certain amount of mud bricks, even if you don't have enough straw or enough resources. If not met, the slaves would be beaten, which is exactly what happened in the book of Exodus. And what's very interesting in that is Exodus chapter 5, the Israelite slaves, right? They were beaten and then they were questioned. So instead of being questioned first and then beaten, they were beaten first and then asked questions, right? And they were asked questions afterward. This is very, what's the word? It's very like sort of Egyptian slavery. And it's very common pretty much only in Egyptian slavery. So this is very unique to Egypt, to be whipped and then, or the ancient Egypt, to be whipped, beaten, and then asked. This is what's described in Exodus chapter 5. Is there any historical merit for that? Yes. In Papyrus British Museum 00052, it describes exactly that. Slaves being beaten and then questioned. So notice how it all correlates, it all corresponds, it all coincides with exactly what's written in the ancient documents. It's very historically reliable, is what I'm trying to say. So another thing that I'd like to mention is, so I started recording. Just real quickly, I suppose, the Pentateuch, right, which is the books of Moses, the early books of the Bible. It has the largest ratio of Egyptian loan words, L-O-A-N words, loan words. Those are words that you borrow from another language. The Pentateuch has so many words that are derived from Egyptian influence that there has got, like, that type of stuff is usually present only if they were under some sort of subjugation. Because if you look at all the other, all the other civilizations that lived in the area, right, in the Levant, like, for example, the Ugaritic people, they only have 5 Egyptian loanwords. The Phoenicians only have 1 Egyptian loanword.
The Moabites, 0. The Ammonites, 0. The Edomites, 0. So if Egypt was just like, oh, it's just a big nation and they have a lot of influence in the area, why didn't they influence these nations that were around? Moabites, 0 loan words from Egypt. Edomites, also. Ammonites, also. Old Aramaic, only 2. Imperial Aramaic rose up to 44, but that was because it comes from, Egyptian Aramaic texts from Egypt. And so they were actual Egyptian texts in Imperial Aramaic. And in fact, the Pentateuch has the largest number has such a high ratio of Egyptian loan words with respect to the rest of the Hebrew Bible. So if you look at all the other books from Joshua all the way to, Malachi, if you compare all the Egyptian loan words from there, Pentateuch still beats it. And so it's a very high Egyptian influence, like even, for example, feminine nouns. And I'm just going to bring this up also because it actually leads into it. So the question is, well, when did this Egyptian loan word borrowing actually occur? Well, it happened between the middle to late Bronze Age, which was 2000 BC to 1300 BC. So this is something that you can mention to like atheist people, like, why are there so many Egyptian loan words? And it correlates to this time period, the time period that we believe that they were enslaved. Well, if you look at the feminine nouns, for example, the feminine noun endings, it ends with like a T, basically. And Egyptian words during this time period, the feminine nouns would also end with a T. But later on in the Egyptian language, they ended up dropping it. They stopped using it. And they stopped using it around the time period of 1350 BC. And so if any borrowing occurred, it would happen basically prior to 1350 BC, which is when we believe that the Israelites were enslaved. Does that make sense? And a lot of people say, well, it sucks that the Pharaoh is not mentioned in the Bible, because if you read the book of Exodus, it just says Pharaoh. It doesn't say Pharaoh and Pharaoh Ramses II or something like that. Well, it does kind of suck that it's not written, right? Like, that would be pretty cool if it was written, right? But there's actually, this further proves that the Egyptian influence that they had. Because basically, between the time period of 15th century BC to 10th century BC, the Egyptians would do the same thing. They would just say Pharaoh. They wouldn't name the Pharaoh. And so it corresponds with what the Egyptians did also. Later on, in later books of the Bible, like the book of Jeremiah, the book of 2nd Chronicles, 2nd Kings, it names the Pharaoh. It says Pharaoh and then the name, right? And those books were written later on, like after, the time period where the Egyptians didn't name Pharaoh, okay? And finally, this one will go back to what many atheists will say. They will say, well, if you look at the numbers of the Bible, like the amount of people that left Egypt, it's about 603,000 men that are mentioned, 603,000, right? Multiply that by 3 to account for all the women and the children and all that. Because that's mainly men that were like, eligible for fighting, basically, like that we find, for example, in the book of Numbers. It'll be a total of like 2 million Israelites. That is a lot, like so much so that they could have just beaten the Egyptians themselves. As in, they wouldn't need to like run away, is what I'm saying. They would outnumber them a lot. Like we're talking, they'd outnumber Egyptians by like 2 to 3. And so it is a lot of Israelites. And that's what atheists bring up. That's one of their arguments that they bring up. They say it's very inaccurate because 603,000 men, I mean, times that by like, what did I times it by? Times that by like 3, I believe. You'll get about 2 million, right? Yeah, times it by 3, you get almost 2 million people. And so that's too much people. Therefore, it's historically unreliable. However, you got to remember two things. Number one, it is a possibility that's hyperbole, because remember we talked about how numbers have a symbolic meaning. That doesn't mean that the text is fake. It just means that the numbers are used for a symbolic purpose to try to express something else. However, you got to realize another thing, that the term that is used for thousand is the term Elep, which it is translated as thousand. It can mean thousand, but it could also mean unit, military unit, fighting force, which would make sense because in the context of talking about a fighting force, it uses that Elep. And so it likely could just be referring to groups of people, okay? And so if you have, let's see, you have a group of, how much was it? I think it's a group of like 20 people per unit, right? 20 people per unit. And then you have 603 units. Whoops. Sorry, I disconnected from the internet, I think, real fast. So 603 Elep, or 603 units, let's say each unit is 20 people. That's about 12,000 men. Times that by about 3, let's say. You get about 36,000 people leaving, which is that's a reasonable amount. And so if Elep is meant to mean fighting unit, which by the way, most scholars nowadays kind of believe that, yeah, it should be unit. And so if you're concerned with what a scholar would say, most scholars, if not all scholars, even like, the conservative ones will say, yeah, it should mean unit. And so it would just be a military unit, a group of people, a platoon, a tribe. It could even mean tribe, actually, tribe. So a group of people, okay? And last thing I want to say, and this is just real quick, a correction that I'd like to make. Back when I recorded Genesis chapter 21, part 2, that's what the video is called, Genesis 21, part 2, I made a mistake. I said that Mount Sinai, which we're going to describe where Mount Sinai is, we're going to locate Mount Sinai and all that. Mount Sinai, I said that it was in the land of Saudi Arabia. I think that's what I said. That's false. So earlier when I talked about people that don't know what they're talking about, that was me also. Okay, I did not know. I made that mistake. Okay, it's not in Saudi Arabia, and I will describe why. And yes, I will describe why next time. And so we're going to talk about the Exodus route and all that, and we're going to start reading. Well, next time actually, we'll read Exodus chapter 1. When we get to Exodus chapter 15 and we start talking about the crossing of the Red Sea and all that, that's when I'm going to describe the route. Okay, and so it's all going to be in order, and even the plagues, believe it or not, are going to reflect historical evidence for the Exodus. I mean, the death of the firstborn, we already got that down, right? Which happened during King Ramses' second reign. So